Hey guys, welcome to my channel. So lately, I've been seeing a lot of discourse on how younger generations are changing how they're approaching love, sex, and relationship, and it's been really interesting to say the least. As you might have heard, we've been seeing a noticeable decline in hookup culture, a growing rejection of dating apps, decreasing marriage rates, and an intriguing rise in voluntary celibacy among younger generations. Indeed, as seen by the popularization of the likes of the boysober and 4B movements, it looks like more and more Gen Z, women in particular, are opting for singlehood, childlessness, and even celibacy for various reasons, to such a degree that many have claimed that the generation is going through a quote-unquote sex recession. So all of that naturally sent me spiraling down a rabbit hole surrounding the societal, political, and historical factors and implications potentially at play here. And there is so much to unpack. From the way historical archetypes like the spinster, the crazy cat lady, and the witch have been used to police and marginalize women who live outside the bounds of marriage and motherhood, to how contemporary unmarried and childless women are now reclaiming singlehood and even celibacy as a form of subtle resistance. Today we're going to be diving into it all. We have a lot to talk about, but it's going to be fun, I promise. So please buckle in, grab a snack maybe, and without further ado, let's get into it.
It's called going boy sober. No dating, no kissing, and no sex for a period of time. And some therapists say it shows how Gen Z is rewriting the rules around dating and sex. Hope Woodard started using the term in her TikToks. She was tired of dating and says going boy sober made her reflect.
Who are you without someone? What is it that you want?
Celibacy is having a moment, and it's showing up in different ways in other countries too.
This generation, they've grown up in a world where the old systems don't necessarily serve them, and sometimes they're opting out.
Now, this isn't the same as religious celibacy, which has been around for centuries. For this student, going boy sober was about healing from a breakup.
I struggled with codependency, so I knew I would need to work on being independent.
Tima's rules included not making friends with cute guys and no texting boys back after 9 p.m.
Nothing good happens past hour 9 p.m.
But it wasn't entirely easy to make the changes.
I really found it hard to set boundaries or restrictions for people. I feel like I've really gotten to know myself and have this newfound respect for myself.
Attitudes and behaviors around sex and relationships have noticeably shifted. A study published in January by researchers at Rutgers University and the University of Albany revealed that young American adults are having 14% less casual sex than their counterparts from a decade ago, signaling what some are calling a Gen Z sex recession. As a matter of fact, according to the study, in 2007, 38% of the young adults that were studied reported having casual sex. However, by 2017, 10 years later, that number had fallen down to 24%, which is 14% less. And this study wasn't alone in its findings. In recent years, several university studies across the US, the UK, and Australia have suggested that Gen Z is having a considerably lesser amount of sex than previous generations were at that same age. During my research for this video, I've seen that the word Puritan, a portmanteau of the words Puritan and teen, was being thrown out quite a bit in regards to this conversation. But yeah, this particular decline reflects a lot of broader trends within younger generations, including the decreased interest in participating in hookup culture, the waning popularity of dating apps, and of course the increased attention to decentering men and abandoning the male gaze. And of course, hookup culture and dating apps have been kinda synonymous in this day and age. But a lot of people are growing kinda tired of this commodification of dating and this gamification of love. And for many, these apps have kind of stripped away the authenticity of connections and are leaving users feeling alienated and unsatisfied with their experiences, leading to a growing number of young people rethinking their approach to sex and relationships. And obviously, it's impossible to generalize about an entire generation. However, there has also been a shift recently that kind of signals a disinterest in the dating practices of the past. YouTubers Khadija Maboe and Madison Brown have made some really interesting videos about the subject and the apparent end of the hoe phase, which I found really interesting and I really recommend watching if you haven't already. Some critics have theorized that Gen Z's retreat from casual sex and dating apps is not so much about prudishness, but maybe more so about a desire for deeper and more meaningful connections in this increasingly commodified and digital world, which I personally think is a very valid take. It's also important to recognize that this generation has grown up in a post-Me Too era, a movement that significantly raised awareness about the pervasiveness of sexual violence and the importance of consent, which might have affected our attitudes around hookup culture as well. For instance, the boy-sober movement, popularized on TikTok, reflects a growing trend among Gen Z who are choosing to opt out of dating and casual sex to focus on self-care, healing, and personal growth. The guidelines of the boy-sober movement vary among practitioners, but some of the common guidelines include avoiding hookups, flings, dating, late-night texting, and even refraining from befriending men altogether. And what's so interesting about the rise of the boysober movement is that there's no one particular reason why people are doing it. It can be driven by several differing factors depending on the person. For some, turning to celibacy can be a tool for personal growth, for focusing their energy on themselves, on their careers, or on school. For others, it can be to heal from self-esteem and body image issues or past trauma, allowing themselves to create healthier patterns and boundaries for potential future relationships. Many have also opted for celibacy as a means to regain autonomy over their own bodies, specifically as a response to the increasing threat to reproductive rights, especially with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which signals the increasing restrictions and criminalization of abortion and of women's reproductive and human rights being threatened more and more so every day.
Well, you just revealed that you've been 2.5 years celibate. What made you want to, one, do that, but then also just reveal that?
Well, actually, I had been talking about it, but I guess it didn't get like picked up in that way. But I've been very open about it. And then when I saw the Bumble ad thing going down, saying like whatever it was, like yeah, right, like celibacy isn't an option or whatever, I was like, well, actually, but also celibacy isn't the right term because celibacy is like you're not having sex for religious purposes. So I'm not celibate because I'm like, a follower of Christ. I'm abstinent. I'm abstaining from sex because I felt like with the overturning of Roe v. Wade that if they were going to take away our rights to our body and our reproductive rights, well, then this is my way of taking them back. And I feel like more women should really get on that because we hold the power. And now I like don't even think about it. Like I don't care. It doesn't interest me, and I've really truly never been better.
Ultimately, the underlying message that I've noticed from the boysober trend is that it reflects a greater desire for autonomy and empowerment, and the promotion of the idea that one's value and well-being are not dependent on romantic or sexual validation. And of course, while the boysober movement might resonate with many, it's obviously important to recognize that celibacy will never be a one-size-fits-all solution. Rather, the movement highlights the importance of respecting diverse personal choices and of acknowledging that what may be suitable for one person might not work for another. A similar movement has been gaining traction among South Korean women too. The so-called 4B movement is both an ideological stance and a lifestyle that aims to completely decenter men from your life. It's called 4B because, if I understand correctly, 4B is shorthand for 4 Korean words that all start with B or no. Again, if I understand correctly, which honestly I might not be, so if I'm wrong, please feel free to correct me in the comments. But to my understanding, the 4 words translate to 1. The refusal of heterosexual marriage, 2. The refusal of childbirth, 3. The refusal of dating, and 4. The rejection of heterosexual sexual relationships. That's a mouthful. Of course, that may seem a bit extreme at first, but for the adherents of the movement, it's been a way to actively fight back against the patriarchy and the misogyny that they consider so rooted in Korean culture, and partially take back the autonomy over their own lives. I read a really interesting article on the 4B movement on The Cut, and I'll just put the title on the screen here because if any of you are interested in the subject, they honestly do a way better job at describing the movement than me, and I really recommend checking it out. To better understand why movements like these have evolved, I think it would be beneficial to go back in time and to do a brief review of the ebbs and flows of sexual liberation and repression throughout recent history. And while I am aware that the modern sexual liberation movement has its origin in the 1800s, I will personally focus on the 20th century onwards since I'm more familiar with that time period, and I will be concentrating on the Western history because, again, I personally am more familiar with the Western context. So let's begin with the Roaring Twenties, a period that was marked by an early wave of social and sexual liberation following the hardships and graveness of World War I. During this time, women particularly began to challenge traditional gender roles through their fashion, behavior, and sexuality. The rise of the flapper perfectly symbolizes this shift, with women willingly defying the established norms and embracing new forms of expression characterized by an exuberance, confidence, and experimentation that was never seen before. However, the 1950s saw a big conservative resurgence, with the post-World War II emphasis on traditional gender roles and the nuclear family. As I'm sure you know, women were expected to be wives and homemakers, caring for their 2.2 children while their husbands worked. And of course, she better not step outside the line or will schedule a visit to the doctor for a lobotomy, some electroconvulsive therapy, or maybe even confinement to an inhumane psychiatric ward. So, as you can imagine, this period brought with it a wave of sexual repression for women. The 1960s, however, saw big changes, heralding one of the, if not the most notable sexual revolutions in history. Influenced by the civil rights movement, feminist activism, and the newfound availability of the birth control pill, this decade saw another dramatic shift towards sexual freedom. Women in particular continued to challenge traditional views on sex, gender roles, and women's rights. And this era led to an increased acceptance of sex outside marriage, homosexuality, and women's equality. However, as is often the case, significant social shift will often provoke a pushback. And that's exactly what happened during the 1980s, where the West witnessed a substantial conservative reaction as a response to the newfound sexual freedoms of the 60s and the 70s. This period is closely associated with the rise of the religious right, with Presidents Reagan and Bush, both Republicans, playing key roles in promoting conservative values during the decade. And of course, there was the HIV/AIDS crisis during this period, which kind of fueled a dramatic return to the so-called traditional values, promoting sexual restraint and moral conservatism, and fueling vicious hate and discrimination against those who didn't fall into that box. So again, as you can imagine, this was another big period of sexual repression. Jump ahead to the 2000s, where the West saw a broader discourse on sex positivity and more diverse sexual identities. Shows like Sex and the City mainstreamed conversations about sex and singlehood for women, and shows like Queer as Folk and The L Word pioneered LGBTQ+ representation in television. Coupled with the rise of the internet, the 2000s saw a rise in visibility and dialogue surrounding sexual liberation. Of course, these portrayals and discussions were not without flaws, but it was a start at least. The 2010s kind of continued what the 2000s started, and we saw the widespread adoption of dating apps, which completely changed how people approached romantic and sexual relationships. This period also saw the legalization of same-sex marriage in the US, a surge in sex and body positivity activism, and heightened discussions around consent, particularly following the Me Too movement and advancements in reproductive rights under Obama's presidency, specifically with the introduction of the birth control mandate, who ensured a more widespread access to contraception and family planning services. And jump to the present day, the 2020s, we see that a lot of people are opting for voluntary celibacy, or at least having less sex than previous generations. And what's so interesting is that at the first glance, movements like the boysober movement and the 4B movement might seem to contradict the ideals of sexual liberation, which was relatively pro-sex and championed sex positivity. However, despite their focus on celibacy, I personally argue that these trends align and complement with the core values of the sexual liberation movement perfectly, because they emphasize the importance of intentionality and of personal choice in one's sexual and romantic life. Unlike how the sexual liberation of the 60s emphasized sexual freedom as an active rejection of the repression that was imposed onto them in the previous decades, the likes of the boysober movement reflect more so a response to the pressures of modern dating culture and the current political climate. So, rather than opposing sexual freedom, these movements highlight that true sexual liberation actually means that you can choose what makes you feel best without judgment. This whole conversation about Gen Z embracing celibacy got me thinking about the Victorian spinster, and it led me down a fascinating rabbit hole of research. I want to share some of that history with you because it's not only really interesting, but it also provides valuable context on how women have historically navigated the conflict between societal expectations and autonomy. For any of you who may not be familiar with the term of the spinster, spinsters are women who never marry. They are daughters but not wives, often sisters or aunts but rarely mothers. Their history, the contrapuntal echo of family. As such, in a time that equated womanhood with childbearing and marriage, spinsters were often outcasts and subject to a lot of vitriol, judgment, and abuse. I've seen many researchers claim that spinsters kind of occupied a sort of queer-adjacent position in society, which I think is such an interesting way to put it. Queer not necessarily due to their sexual orientation, although for sure some spinsters were probably gay, but more so because of their divergence from traditional gender roles and the heterosexual expectations of the time. But again, being a spinster was a great cover for actual queer women too, especially in a time like the Victorian era where society was largely homosocial, meaning that men and women were largely separated in most areas of society. Women spend most of their time with other women, greatly isolated from men in their day-to-day lives. And a lot of researchers found that it was not uncommon for women to form deep, often relationship friendships with other women, with some even building their households together. And again, these relationships were not always sexual, but they did exist in the periphery of the conventional romantic framework. And by choosing to live with other women or independently, spinsters challenged the norms of heterosexual domesticity that were so prevalent at the time. Alexander Doty, a writer that specializes in queer interpretations of mass culture, explained that he used the word queer not only to refer to gay, lesbian, and bisexual identities, but also to refer to a range of expressions that included all other potential and potentially unclassifiable non-straight positions. I found really interesting because, in a way, the spinster did occupy such a position in society. Writer Tones Helson came to similar conclusions as well, saying that the queerness of the spinster during this period is not based primarily in her lacking sexual life or in her homoerotic or homosocial friendships with other women. The spinster's aberration lies first and foremost in her failure to pursue romantic love and motherhood, in her attempt to assume a position in the public domain and thus upset the established division between the male and the female spheres. The spinster was queer, but the substance of her queerness was different than it would be later in the 1900s. And something I found so wholesome while researching for this video, that there's a lot of literature that emphasizes how important the notion of the home was to the spinster, as well as all of her contemporary descendants. For these women, who were often outcast from society, creating a beautiful and peaceful household was a way for them to reclaim a sense of fulfillment, of belonging, and of normalcy. And thus, the desire to create a home of her own became one of the most prominent goals for the middle-class spinsters. However, while homes have traditionally been tied to femininity, civilization, marriage, and motherhood, spinsters pursued home ownership for completely different reasons. They didn't want a house for it to serve as a space for her husband and her children. They wanted it as a refuge, as a source of freedom and peace for themselves and themselves only. Susan B. Anthony, a prominent figure in women's rights activism, wrote beautifully about this desire. All this is done from the pure love of home. No spurious second-hand domesticity affected for the praise of some man, or conscientiously maintained for the comfort of the one who furnishes the money, nor because she has nothing else to busy herself about, but her own impelling motive is from the very true womanly home instinct, unsurpassed by that of any of the women who have all of the rights they want, referring to marriage. But of course, sadly, rare was the spinster who could actually own her own house. As you surely know, for most of Western history, it was very difficult for women to own property unless it was handed down by a father or bought by a husband. However, over time, as laws changed and women began to own property, the home remained central to the identity of the spinster. And when we think of the childless cat lady, for example, a sort of modern variation of the spinster, we often view her as homely, as antisocial, as homebound. So it's interesting to think about how the concept of the home has always been intertwined with our perception of the unmarried woman, which is a perfect segue to the cat lady. And fittingly, I have one of my cats here and the other one on the bed. I don't know if you can see her. So we're good. But yeah, a relatively recent figure, the childless cat lady arose in the last century along with the increasing domestication and commodification of animals as household pets. Dogs and cats, who were traditionally seen as mere accessories to the nuclear family, have since become companions in their own rights, integral family members themselves. And this is where the cat lady enters. In a post-industrial moment when pet love has become a centerpiece of normal life, the crazy cat lady occupies a queer periphery. She not only loves cats too much, she loves them more than humans, instead of a husband, and quite literally, in place of heteronormative domesticity. The cat lady, often depicted as a single, childless woman, creates her own family, one that is not defined by human reproduction or romantic partnerships, but by chosen non-human companions. A reconfiguration of the family unit that is inherently political, as it challenges the patriarchal notion that a woman woman's worth is inherently tied with her ability to have a husband and children. And therefore, the childless cat lady, just like the spinster before her, threatens politicians and policymakers who want to control women and police their body and their autonomy. And this is exactly why the cat lady is so often portrayed as a crazy or abject figure, to pathologize and marginalize women who step outside of the line. In a way, the crazy cat lady is a form of social control, a way of reinforcing the idea that women who do not conform to the expectations of marriage and motherhood are somehow incomplete and flawed. The 2004 SNL Christmas skit exemplifies these sentiments perfectly, with Robert De Niro playing the role of an unstable, miserable cat lady, whose cats are the mere consolation prizes to her failed dreams of achieving the nuclear family that every woman needs to be complete. And these notions seem so antiquated because obviously they are, but unfortunately they're still very present today. Take, for example, the controversy that recently surfaced surrounding J.D. Vance, who had recently criticized a lot of prominent Democrats like Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, sorry, I cannot pronounce his name, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for not having biological children, as well as having derogatorily referred to others as weird cat ladies who have too much power.
We're effectively run in this country via the Democrats, via our corporate oligarchs, by a bunch of childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives and the choices that they've made, and so they want to make the rest of the country miserable too. If you look at Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, AOC, the entire future of the Democrats is controlled by people without children.
His comments obviously sparked backlash, as they should, rightfully so, and yeah, I think it's just so stupid, and it shows how even today these notions are still present. But anyway, this isn't a video about J.D. Vance or his political views or questionable comments, but that particular cat lady remark of his did partially inspire this video. It got me thinking about the discrimination faced against childless unmarried women throughout history, and I went down a big rabbit hole from the history of the spinster, to the cat lady, to the Gen Z reclamation of celibacy. However, one positive thing that did emerge from this controversy is that I've been seeing a lot of childless women with cats or dogs posting these really funny TikToks fighting back against J.D. Vance's stupid comments, and it kind of started this movement of cat ladies or dog ladies reclaiming the term, reclaiming cat ladies, using camp and parody and satire, which I think is really cool. Yeah, we took a little bit of a tangent, I'm sorry about that, but to get back to our earlier conversation, in the article on South Korea's 4B movement that I mentioned earlier, they stated that ever since 2013, the rate of college enrollment in Korean women has continuously surpassed the one of men's, with nearly 3/4 of Korean women being enrolled in or having completed higher education, as opposed to only less than 2/3 of their male counterparts. And this trend isn't exclusive to South Korea. It's been noticed all around the world, especially in the last decades. For instance, a 2023 report from NBC News reported that in the US, women now outnumber men in college and graduate school enrollments, with 56% of women having been enrolled in higher education institutions as opposed to only 44% in men. And this represents a significant change from the past, and it's a trend that's not likely to reverse anytime soon. According to that NBC News report I was talking about, in 1970, about only 8% of women had bachelor's degrees, compared to 14% of men. And apparently, over time, the gender gap steadily narrowed, and by 2010, educational attainment between men and women had pretty much equalized. And as we can see now, ever since then, the balance has shifted the other side, with women in the lead now. All that to say, what we're seeing now is women's economic, educational, and social power being higher than it's ever been before, to a degree where women are in a position where they no longer need to rely solely on men, and thus marriage has severely lost its appeal for a lot of women.
So apparently the term spinster was originally a word used to describe women who were so good at weaving that they were financially independent. And eventually that got conflated with women who remained unmarried after a certain age. And while correlation does not equal causation, it kind of seems like finances are a driving factor in marriage. So this may be kind of a conspiracy theory, but is lack of equal pay and equal opportunity for women within the workplace potentially a way to keep men relevant by undermining women's ability to be financially independent? And if all women were financially independent, would they still choose to marry men? God knows I didn't.
And going back to the conversation we were having earlier, but the single and unmarried woman's ability to not only survive but to thrive without a husband reveals a severe crack in the heteronormative and patriarchal narratives that want women to believe that they need a man for security and fulfillment. By simply existing outside of the confines that have always been imposed upon her, the single, childless woman demonstrates that a woman's life can be complete without adhering to the traditional gender roles of mother and wife, and thus presents a threat to our established patriarchal social order, because as we know, ultimately, society is afraid of women it cannot control. And maybe it's less the case today, even though I would argue that this kind of thinking is still very pervasive. But it's worth noting that for most of human history, societies all over the world equated femininity with domesticity and childbearing. And that's why the spinster and the cat lady represented such a radical, threatening deviation from their definition of femininity. So much so that in the 19th century, unmarried childless women were often dehumanizingly referred to as the third sex. And it's interesting because historically, the label of the third sex has also been used to refer to homosexuality, which kind of comes back to our point on how spinsters, straight or not, kind of took up a queer-adjacent position in society. But yeah, referring to an unmarried woman as the third sex is the most blatant representation of the traditional way of thinking that womanhood lies in childbearing and marriage. And spinsters, in their belief that women were inherently complete without adhering to these roles, were actually really avant-gardist in their thinking. And of course, wanting to get married and having kids is completely fine. But again, the real importance lies in having the autonomy to be able to make that choice for yourself. And it's been so fascinating going into this subject because by the outside, by society, the spinsters were completely viewed as the absolute antithesis of femininity. They were literally the third sex. They were subject to ridicule, to harassment, to marginalization. They were ostracized by family members and friends. Heck, they were seen as such threats to the established status quo that traditionalist policymakers and politicians in England actually created immigration policies just for the sole purpose of sending these excess women overseas to the British colonies to work or marry. Or again, the trope of the witch has always been a spinster too. Not only in the media, with the representations of evil, childless witches who want to steal, kill, and eat children, but also in real life too. During the infamous witch hunts, for instance, people would persecute these independent, intelligent, single, childless, aging women simply because they didn't conform. Spinsters have always been seen as threats to society, and I argue that it's the same today. However, spinsters saw themselves in a very different light than the one that society had cast upon them. In fact, through their eyes, through being completely untethered and non-influenced by masculinity and men, and by being virtually detached from the patriarchy and the roles it assigns onto women, spinster believed that she was the epitome of true femininity and womanhood. As writer Tones Helson perfectly put it in their 2008 article on the subject, the spinster, or the new woman, challenged contemporary perceptions of femininity. Motherhood and involvement in complementary heterosexual relationships were key aspects of being a woman. Education and intelligence, pursuing an occupation, and involvement in society were associated with manliness. The spinster was thus a liminal figure. Both in medical circles and in society at large, there were voices claiming that the new woman were not real women. There was a huge gap between the way the members of the community of spinsters perceived themselves as the guardians of true femininity, indeed of true humanity, and the perception of the spinster as the third sex. Something else that's interesting to consider is how there are such significant gendered nuances in how society and the media perceive singlehood and childlessness in both men and women. For instance, single women are often cast as sad spinsters or crazy cat ladies, portrayals that view them as incomplete and defective without a husband or children, while single men on the other side are more likely to be portrayed as eligible bachelors or sexy womanizers. This dichotomy can be observed in the movie Bridget Jones' Diary, for example, with Bridget depicted as a tragic, lonely, desperate woman, with us constantly being reminded that her singleness is a flaw. while her male counterparts are just eligible bachelors who don't face the same expectations or struggles. There is also the clear issue of ageism, which is disproportionately exclusive to women, with those societal pressures intensifying as women age, often tied to their so-called biological clock, or the idea that women are somehow expired if they are unmarried by a certain date, pressures that men largely escape. This gender difference can also reflect the differing aging beauty standards for men and women, with women being expected to hold on to eternal youth while men just get better as they age. Plus, God forbid women make the conscious decision to focus on their career instead of settling down and having kids. They're often immediately met with judgment, being labeled as cold career woman or selfish, while men who make the same choices are often just celebrated for their ambition, their drive, or their success. Like writer Hannah Dupree said it, although childless single women violate gender norms for not having a family to take care of, gender norms for men dictate that they should be agentic and career-driven. Thus, men who remain single to pursue career-related goals are not seen to be violating gender norms as overtly as women who remain single for similar reasons. Well, this is pretty much it for today's video. I really hope you enjoyed. I had truly so much fun putting it all together. I'm also really happy because in the last few months I had been taking a break from posting on YouTube, and I'm so glad to be officially back. I have so many great videos planned for the following weeks, and I cannot wait to share them with you guys, and I really hope you will tune in. But anyways, thanks again for spending this time with me, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Bye!